Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So this series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, June 11th, 1963, we're breaking format a bit today and talking about 4 things. This was a day in which 4 really significant events, 4 moments that sear themselves into our historical memory, all happened on the same day. So, June 11th, 1963 was the day that Alabama Governor George Wallace blocked the entrance to the University of Alabama in an attempt to keep out 2 black students from entering and desegregating the school. In response, President Kennedy ordered that the Alabama National Guard be federalized. The Guard then ordered Wallace to step aside and let the students through a few hours later. The second event related, that evening, JFK delivered a groundbreaking civil rights speech to the country, televised across the country, declaring that the U.S., quote, will not be fully free until all of its citizens are free. The third moment, later that night, technically just after midnight, civil rights activist Medgar Evers is assassinated in front of his home. He had just gotten home from watching Kennedy's speech, actually, and reports were that he was overjoyed by the remarks. Now, this is one of the first significant political killings of the 60s, the killing of a civilian organizer. It would take decades for the man who killed Evers, Byron de la Beckwith, to face trial. Meanwhile, across the world, Buddhist monks marched through the streets of Saigon protesting the U.S.-backed president of South Vietnam. Now, one of those monks set himself on fire. This is an image that many of you can probably conjure right now. It was an image, photo that traveled around the world and brought the rising conflict in Vietnam to even greater attention. So we have 4 events, lots to discuss, and this is supposed to be a short podcast, so let's get into it. We may go a little long, but I am joined, as always, by Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Nikki.
Hi, Jody.
And back with us for this episode is Josh Levin of Slate. He is the host of the new season of Slow Burn, which is out now, and it is all about David Duke. We'll talk about David Duke's connection to all of this at the end of this episode. But hello, Josh. Thanks for coming back.
Hey, Jody.
So, Nikki, I want to start here with, this is a bit of a breaking format, as I mentioned, and we have these 4 events. Is it just like a quirk of history that these 4 things all happened, or do they somehow feel connected to you?
They do feel connected to me. I mean, of course, the George Wallace speech and the Kennedy speech are in response to one another, right? They're part of the same set of events, which is this effort to use federal forces in order to enforce a Supreme Court ruling about desegregating schools in the South. The murder of Medgar Evers takes us a step back, and we can say, yeah, it's in the middle of this civil rights movement in which leaders were being abused and assassinated in this real struggle for civil rights that went well beyond the courtrooms or the ballot box to the fight for people's lives. And then if we take the camera just like one step back, it's in this time in the world in which there is a pretty substantial pushback to racist colonialism. And part of what you're seeing in U.S. involvement kind of all around the world is that the U.S. is getting tangled up in those anti-colonial movements and is sometimes on the wrong side of brutal regimes. And I think the self-immolation is part of seeing the brutality of a regime that the U.S. has aligned itself with in South Vietnam.
So, Josh, right before we were taping, you brought up a good point, which is what actually was on the front pages of the newspaper the next day, and we looked it up. So you want to tell us what we found?
Yeah, what we found is A1 of the Times played George Wallace at the top of A1, right? The headline, Alabama admits Negro students, Wallace bows to federal force, and then Kennedy sees moral crisis in U.S. I think part of this has to do with print deadlines and where things fell during the day. But it's interesting that Alabama admits Negro students is the top line for me, and that Kennedy's speech gets mentioned third in that list, the moral crisis in the U.S.
Right. And then moreover, that the National Guard was there, maybe, was you could see that being the headline maybe even too, that you had this showdown.
Yeah, I mean, there was this tense moment and people didn't really know what to expect. I mean, one of the reasons Kennedy was giving a speech that night is that in federalizing the Alabama National Guard and really forcing this conflict between the state government and the federal government after Wallace's speech, it could have turned pretty violent and pretty bloody. And when it sort of de-escalated and was handled in a less kind of confrontational way without the expected levels of violence, Kennedy's advisors weren't even sure that he should give this speech because it looked like things were peaceful. And Kennedy went ahead with it anyway, which I think was a really critical moment in his presidency.
So, Nicole, are you telling me that you can send federal troops into a city to keep the peace and calm things down?
I know it's a shocking thing, the idea that the U.S. military might be on the side of people of color claiming their rights in the U.S., but in fact, that did happen in our history.
So, Josh, I kind of want to talk a little bit about, the power of images here. I mean, obviously, these are ones that are all seared into our heads. I mean, I think, we can conjure up the image of the showdown in front of the school. We can certainly conjure the image of the monk setting himself on fire. You've been sort of diving into another historical story. Like, how much do images, like actual images, matter in terms of how we remember moments?
Oh, I think they're hugely important. And I think, this being an era in the 60s where an image in a news weekly or in a newspaper had so much power. And when people were also just watching the same network TV newscasts, right? We're in this 3-channel universe. And so you get the sense and a true sense that you're experiencing the same things that everyone else is experiencing in America. You're all looking at not only the same stories, but you're looking at the same set of images, moving images, same set of anchors. And so there is this shared vocabulary, shared set of images, shared conversation that's going on.
And we talked a little bit about the newspaper headlines. Apparently Kennedy himself found out about the self-immolation of the monk from a newspaper while he was in a meeting about how to deal with Alabama. And so even the president of the United States was sort of undergoing the same sort of whiplash and processing of information that I think citizens were.
And the self-immolation, Jody, I think it gets back to the question that you asked about images. And I think particularly in this time when there was so much happening in the U.S., for a story from far away to break through in the way that this one did, I think speaks to the particular power and importance of images of events that happen in foreign lands. I mean, we saw that with just the horrifying and terrible images we saw of Syrian refugees and how that changed the conversation here and put the crisis there at the forefront of people's minds. And then, particularly on this day when so much was happening, for the story from Vietnam to break through, I think is just a testament to the power of that act and of that image.
Nikki, we've touched on this. I think when we did our episode about 1968, we talked about this a little bit. Certainly something that's on my mind now, which is like, again, this idea of how do all the big things seem to happen at the same time? And is that a coincidence? Are they all related? But then moreover, do they cut into each other in terms of attention and people really sort of understand the gravity of it? Is it a zero-sum game of like, this is history that we're living through? Or do they somehow build on each other and, oh my God, all these things are happening at the same time?
I think it's different in different periods, but in this period, it's more of a stacking effect in which each thing that's happening is feeding into a bigger underlying argument, right? So George Wallace standing on the schoolhouse steps and saying segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, that feeds into Kennedy's speech. And Kennedy's speech on civil rights, his hand is being forced in a way by the civil rights activism that had been happening for almost a decade at that point. And so it all accumulates at a certain point, and in this case, it's going to accumulate across the length of this decade, but they're reinforcing events in a lot of ways. And you see in 1968, if we're talking about things like police brutality, it is coming not just against Black Americans trying to get their rights, but it is anti-war protesters as well. So you're going to see these all sort of come together by the end of the decade.
We mentioned the National Guard in this guise as kind of a peacekeeping force, but there's a lot of violence in these stories. And, you think of George Wallace in a very real way, representing the kind of violence of the state, of a governor with power to really harm people, and particularly Black people. Then you have the murder of Evers by Byron Della Beckwith, who was a member of the Klan. The Klan liked to style itself as the invisible empire. And so you then have this kind of shadowy vigilante kind of violence happening. And it takes 30 years for Beckwith to be convicted of this crime. And so, you also have Kennedy standing, up from the most powerful position in the country and in the world. And there's a lot of power there. But just imagining being an American, watching all this, being what it must have felt like to be a Black American, and just feeling like this country was coming at you and attacking you from all of these different levels, in places you could see, and then from the shadows as well. It's just terrifying.
Yeah, and we're talking about this particular moment in 63, but the people that we're talking about all are either assassinated or self-immolate or have assassination attempts against them. I mean, Kennedy, of course, is killed just a few months later, and George Wallace has an attempted assassination that leaves him in a wheelchair in 1972. And it gives you a sense of exactly that theme of violence and mounting violence that is going to shape and haunt American politics over the course of the 60s and into the 70s.
And David Duke defended Byron Della Beckwith for years. Della Beckwith was a cause célèbre among people on the far-right fringe. And so he was a figure who kind of haunted America for decades after this assassination.
I want to say something that, I don't know, hopefully it doesn't come off like I'm ranking the impact of these various events, but I do want to say that the Evers assassination, when you talk to people who lived through this era, I talked to my parents about living through this era, when you read about this moment, stories like that, the assassination of Evers, for some reason, that was the one that really seemed to break through for a lot of people. I'll just say Bob Dylan wrote a song about Evers. Nina Simone wrote Mississippi Goddamn about Evers. There's a Phil Oakes song. I mean, it just broke through. And I think it's maybe because, as you were saying, Nicole, that it was the first in this string of assassinations, but also that he was a civilian. He was an organizer. And at some level, we maybe are more used to or even accept political violence or violence towards prominent figures, and we would see that, but he was just an activist and an organizer, and I think that stopped a lot of people in their tracks.
Yeah, I mean, civil rights activists were certainly well aware of the risks that they faced in their activism. But even if you read Anne Moody's memoir, Coming of Age in Mississippi, she was a civil rights activist in the sit-ins in the early 60s and was working with people like Evers and like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And the impact of Evers' assassination, this realization that the leaders of this movement not only could be killed, but were being killed, is a chilling and dramatic and turning point moment in her life and in her activism.
Josh, let's bring this back to David Duke. I'm curious, you mentioned that he defended Della Beckwith, but where is David Duke at this point in 1963? And then moreover, I feel like we talk so much about people whose experiences were shaped by the civil rights movement, and we mostly talk about people on the left. Are there people like David Duke who, talk a little about how a civil rights movement and an era influences him?
So Duke was born in 1950, and it's right around this time that he becomes involved with the White Citizens Council in New Orleans. as a teenager, and these groups came into existence to oppose school integration and just very virulently opposed to the desegregation efforts that are happening in New Orleans. And so Duke finds a community among these people, and this was not a fringe group in the South at that time. You could have these very racist views and be in the mainstream of white society. And so I think Duke found an environment there that was congenial to him, that helped mold him. But interestingly, he was also getting into Nazism and finding himself drawn to Hitler. And the folks in the White Citizens Council were less into that. And so Duke found himself even a little bit of an outcast among his fellow racists.
Yeah, that's really fascinating because the Citizens Council really was like the racists in suits of the South in that period. And for Duke, he had an array of options for how to be a white racist. And he chose one of the more fringe groups. And then that creates this hurdle for him to overcome for the rest of his political career as he tries to find a way back into the white racist mainstream.
All right, let's leave it there. And we ended with a little bit on David Duke. You can find out a lot more about David Duke in the new season of Slow Burn. So, Josh, first 3 episodes are out now. They came out yesterday. If you're listening to this on the day our show comes out. Now, are you week by week now after this? Well, how's the rest of the season going?
Yeah, so the first 3 are out for people that belong to the Slate Plus membership program. If you don't, the first 3 will come out week by week. You can listen to the first one this week. And then the rest of the season, 6 episodes, will be coming out week by week into July.
All right. Well, congratulations again on that. And thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Jody, and thank you, Nikki.
Thanks. I'm really excited about the podcast.
Oh, yeah.
Appreciate it.
All right. This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX. You can find out lots more about the show, including how to suggest a topic at thisdaypod.com. Follow our Instagram and Twitter feeds at thisdaypod. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
This is one country. It has become one country because all of us and all the people who came here had an equal chance to develop their talents. We cannot say to 10% of the population that you can't have that right. Your children can't have the chance to develop whatever talents they have. That the only way that they are going to get their rights is to go in the street and demonstrate.
Radiotopia.